Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Gwei Refuel, where I recap the latest news in the Ethereum ecosystem. I'm your host, Anthony Sassano, and today's the 18th of May, 2023. All right, everyone, let's get into it. So, apologies for missing yesterday's episode. It's funny, on Monday I said to myself, this week I'm not going to miss an episode of the refuel, but alas, the world had other plans for me, so apologies for that one. But I shouldn't miss tomorrow's episode, so we'll get most of the week out there. And also, one other thing that multiple people have brought up with me is that on Tuesday's refuel, I mentioned that the DAO event was a rollback of the Ethereum chain. Now, that is obviously not correct. I misspoke. I'm actually usually pretty good with that, but what ended up happening with the DAO event in 2016, was that there was an irregular state transition. It was not a rollback of the chain. No transactions were rolled back. There was a state change where basically the balance of the ETH that was drained out of the DAO was taken from the hacker and returned to a contract, which then was paid out later to all of the relevant users. So it was not a rollback of the change. It's what we call an irregular state change or regular state transition. Irregular meaning it wasn't obviously part of the regular functioning of the chain, and it had to be done out of band via a socially coordinated fork. And that happened in 2016 for those of you who don't know. So you can just Google the DAO Ethereum and you can get a history on what that was there. But yeah, thank you to the people who brought me up on that. I obviously misspoke on Tuesday's refuel. But anyway, let's get into the news since then. And I think it'd be a miss for me not to talk about this, even though it seems like old news at this point. But I'm sure you've all seen all the drama surrounding the Ledger, I guess, like new feature that they introduced called Ledger Recover. And this drama has been going on for about 48 hours now. Now, I think a lot of it is justified because a lot of people feel betrayed by Ledger, the company. But I think there's also a lot of just general confusion out there about what a Ledger actually is and what a hardware wallet actually is. So I want to start at the beginning, really, and explain exactly what Ledger announced and why people are upset about it. So they announced this new feature called Ledger Recover, which essentially allows you to back up your seed phrase private key with various custodians. Now, Ledger is one of them, and then there are two other companies that they've contracted to be the others. And essentially what you would do is you would generate this new kind of like phrase, or I guess like this new secret phrase from your ledger. It would be encrypted, and it's using Shamir secret sharing, and then it will be fragmented into three different parts, and those three parts would go to Ledger and the two other companies. And then if you wanted to reconstruct it because, say, you lost your ledger or you lost your seed phrase, if you wanted to get access back to your funds, you would need two of three of those fragments or shards in order to recreate the private key. Now, the reason why Ledger introduced this feature was because they have a huge user base, and there's a lot of, I guess, people as part of that user base that are scared of, I guess, self-custody. They probably don't trust themselves enough to secure their seed phrase. They want to know that there is some kind of recourse if they lose their Ledger device or they lose their seed phrase, for example. So I think that's why Ledger introduced this. But the other reason is that they're charging for this service as well. I think it's like $10, $10 a month or something like that, which is obviously something that that Ledger has been doing more and more of over the past few years, is getting more into the software game, because making, I guess, like profit on hardware is quite difficult in kind of like the end state. So what ends up happening is you sell a lot of hardware devices, but then to make even more money, obviously you're a business, you want to keep growing, you want to keep making more money, you have to move into software. That's what Ledger has been doing with their Ledger Live app and a bunch of other services that they've been offering, like staking, and now they're doing it with this Ledger Recover service. Now, the drama starts basically from the fact that people feel betrayed because they thought that the private key could never be exported from the actual Ledger device. Now, until now, it hasn't been able to. The reason why it can now be exported is because Ledger wrote a new piece of firmware that allows it to get the private key, or I guess like get the encrypted fragments of the private key from the secure enclave that exists on the Ledger device. Now, for those of you who don't know, the firmware is not open source and never has been for Ledger. It is a proprietary piece of code. They keep it closed source because obviously it is a competitive advantage for them to do that. They don't want competitors coming along and just stealing their firmware, stealing their code, and putting it on Ledger devices. They also do, on clones of Ledger devices, and they also do it for security reasons as well, right? At least they believe it's for security reasons. I don't know. I obviously prefer open source software to closed source software, and I think when it comes to this sort of stuff, open sourcing the firmware is basically non-debatable or non-negotiable. But I think for a lot of people, they didn't care about that enough because they used the Ledger devices, right? Now, the fact that they didn't care about it, maybe a lot of them, it was due to them believing that Ledger couldn't actually export, or the device couldn't actually export the private key, and as long as you kept your seed phrase safe and no one had access to your device and they didn't know the pins of the device, your funds would be safe. That is still true. Like, that is still true, guys. But I think that what people are worried about is that maybe one day Ledger is forced by a government agency to write firmware that essentially backdoors the private key, right? Or people are also afraid of there being leaks of users' private keys, because the way that they're doing this Ledger Recover service is through KYC and ID. So if you were to, I guess, like request these fragments from the different companies, you have to basically identify yourself. But we all know that identity theft is not actually hard to pull off. So people are worried about their IDs essentially being, well, I guess, like their IDs being stolen or leaked somewhere, and then those being used to recover the fragments and then and then steal their crypto, essentially. Now, the service is opt-in. This isn't something that everyone is automatically subscribed to, but if you do update the firmware, that capability now exists on your Ledger device, right? And this doesn't apply to Ledger Nano S's yet. It's only to the newer devices, and it's only to the ones that have updated to the latest firmware, and you'll know which firmware it is because it'll be in the firmware notes. You can check that. So if you haven't updated your Ledger, I think over the last week or two, then you don't have this firmware installed. But still, like, people are upset again because, I mean, it's closed source. They don't know exactly what's going on. They had assumed, and Ledger had said multiple times actually, that there was no way to export the private key, and now they're saying that there is, which I guess rightfully so, it has angered a lot of people. Now, I spent the last couple of days looking for the best Twitter threads that I could find on this, and I think one of the best that I found was from Ansgar here, who is a researcher at the Ethereum Foundation, basically describing how this all works from a technical point of view, and how he believes that the update itself doesn't change the trust assumptions around Ledger hardware wallet, but other people would argue that it does, because it increases the attack surface, because now, I guess, like, the secret's out, right? And you can basically no, and then if you were able to compromise Ledger, the company, and push a malicious firmware to the devices, you could potentially steal everyone's private key, or I guess, like, export everyone's private key, and then you need to decrypt it in some fashion, right? And as I said, because the firmware is closed source, we don't actually know how it works under the hood, so there's no real way to know what's going on there. Now, where I sit here is basically, so I sit in, like, the middle ground. I try to sit at the middle ground for a lot of issues, but I think with this one in particular, I thought a lot about it, and I think, okay, well, I use multiple hardware wallets. I don't just use one, right? I've used Ledgers in the past. I use the Lattice one, which is the hardware wallet from Grid Plus. I've used Trezors in the past, but I don't really use them that much these days. I mostly use Ledger and Lattice One, and I have my own various ways of backing up my seed phrases and things like that, right? Obviously, I'm not going to detail that for OPSEC reasons, but that's how I go about it. And I also make use of multi-sig, which I think is a underrated point here. And I think that the most secure way probably these days, and the most trustless way to secure your own funds in a kind of cold storage way, and I guess it technically can't be called cold storage, but still, I think that getting a multi-sig, having like a 2 of 3 multi-sig that you control all the keys to. So for example, you can set up a safe multi-sig address, and then all the signers on that address can be different hardware wallets. One can be a Ledger, one can be a Lattice One, and one can be a Trezor. So that way, even if for some reason the Ledger firmware was compromised and the private key was leaked, they would still need the two other key. Well, sorry, at least one other key if it was a 2 of 3 multi-sig from your other devices in order to access your multi-sig wallet. And that's why multi-sigs are so popular, because even if one device is compromised, the other two, or even if one, I guess, like, private key, I should say, is compromised and it's a 2 of 3 multi-sig, you would still need to compromise another one in order to get access to the funds. So I've made use of multi-sigs myself, definitely, and I know a lot of people do as well. And I think that is just a really great middle ground where essentially you don't have to trust anyone. You don't have to trust any of these hardware manufacturers. Basically, what you just have to trust is that the safe, if you're using the safe multi-sig, you have to trust that the code hasn't got like some massive exploit in it where all funds could be drained or anything like that. And it's been, I mean, Safe has been running for quite a while now. It has a massive amount of funds in there. So if anything was ultra secure as a multi-sig, it definitely is safe. But there's always a risk there. There's no perfect way to custody funds on in crypto, guys. Like even there's no perfect way to custody funds in the traditional world. Like, for example, if you have cash, it's very hard to custody cash in large amounts of cash, at least. If you have like $1 million in cash, which hardly anyone does, except maybe drug dealers, right? But how are you going to custody $1 million worth of cash and be sure that it's secure? Well, if you leave it at home, I mean, if your house gets broken into, you have to hide that somewhere, right? You have to be sure that you've hidden it somewhere that those people can't find it if they break into your house, right? And then bank accounts, for example, get drained all the time. Maybe your account gets hacked because you used a weak password, or maybe it gets socially engineered. So it's the same kind of concept here. Is that security is very hard. There's no perfect solution to security. Securing your crypto funds, obviously, there's a heightened risk there because it's irreversible. Sometimes you can get your funds back. If your bank account gets hacked and things like that. But with crypto, I mean, once the funds are gone, they're gone because it's immutable. There's no one that's going to be saving you here, and that's, I guess, like the scariest bit for a lot of people. But the way you protect yourself, in my mind, is that you just use common sense, right? Don't obviously write your seed phrase down on a piece of paper and leave that piece of paper on the kitchen table for it to be thrown out or for it to just lay there for anyone to see or anything like that, right? Like that's just using common sense. But overall, people's security posture, I think generally, in all facets of basically everything got to do with digital security and even physical security, is not great, unfortunately. And I think that's why Ledger introduced this recover feature. I think that's why a lot of people custody their funds with centralized exchanges, even though we've seen multiple of these things blow up. I think that's why custody solutions are just incredibly popular, because you don't want to be responsible for your own funds. A lot of the time, a lot of people don't want to be responsible for it because they don't trust themselves, right? So yeah, it's up to you how you want to custody your funds. I think that a lot of people listening to the Refuel obviously would prefer to self-custody, but if you want to custody on an exchange, you just have to accept the risk, right? You just have to accept the risk that, I mean, there are multiple risks. Obviously, exchange going under is one risk. Your exchange account getting hacked is another risk. Your exchange account getting socially engineered is another risk. The exchange itself being ordered to freeze your funds by a government is another risk, right? So there's no risk-free way to custody funds here. There's no free lunch when it comes to security and custody. But as long as you're aware of those risks and you're comfortable taking them, then yeah, I mean, that's all you can really do, right? So yeah. Anyway, that was a bit of a tangent about digital security generally, but I think when it comes to just the Ledger situation, as I said, people feel betrayed because they didn't think that it was possible to exfil the private key from the Ledger device. They also feel like this feature was, the fact that this feature can exist on the existing Ledger devices is kind of silly. They should have, the people believe that they should have, introduced another separate Ledger device that you could get Ledger Recover on, and just left the existing devices as they were. Obviously, they weren't going to do that because they have a huge, I guess, quote-unquote, install base with the existing Ledger device owners, and they want to tap into that base. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, there's a middle ground here. I don't think it's as bad as everyone is pointing out, but I don't think it's good either. I think that the communication around how the device actually worked and the communication that Ledger has put out for years now is obviously not great and hasn't been totally accurate and truthful. So if that's a problem you have, you can change. You don't have to use Ledger hardware wallets. You can change to, as I said, like you can have a multi-sig where you use the Ledger hardware wallet, but then you use two other different hardware wallets as signers. You can go use the Grid Plus Lattice 1, which actually just got restocked, I believe. You can go check that out. And you can check out their thread as well about how closed-sourced firmware is just a massive, I guess, like security hole. And they use the example of the CIA having products backdoored for decades because they were able to run a company called, or at least be part of a company called Crypto AG, which installed backdoored firmware onto their devices, which a lot of people and governments around the world bought, and that gave the CIA basically open access to all this encrypted information that they could decrypt, right? So the same could be done for Ledger. Because Ledger firmware is closed source, we have absolutely no idea if a government hasn't installed a backdoor on it, right? And that's why I think a lot of people are now waking up to it and being like, oh wow, okay, this is what can actually be done in a closed source world. Now, Grid Plus has actually made the public commitment here to open source its firmware in Q3. That's a huge win. That's a huge win for Grid Plus. That's a huge win, I think, for the space, because this should encourage other I guess like cold storage hardware device manufacturers to open source their firmware, because if it's not open source, it's a black box. You have no idea what's going on in there, and really you shouldn't trust it no matter what the company says. I mean, I don't trust Ledger the company at all. I definitely don't like that it's closed source. I definitely think that it is a black box, obviously. And to be honest, I'm thinking of just getting rid of my Ledger devices completely, and even getting them off the multi-sigs and things like that. And I'm thinking of just basically going with other devices, especially the open source ones like Lattice 1 will be in Q3. Yeah, but like you can always be improving your security posture, I think, generally, and it's just stuff to think about. So hopefully I've given you a bunch of things to think about in the 15 minutes. Wow, okay, I've gone a little bit over time here, but yeah, hopefully I've given you a bunch of things to think about there. But that's my take on the Ledger stuff. Obviously, there was a lot of noise on Twitter, so hopefully that summarized it for you there. Anyway, moving on to a bunch of other updates. So Off-Chain Labs, or Prylabs, who what was acquired by Off-Chain Labs, has put out their post-mortem report on the Ethereum mainnet finality issues that primarily were caused by the Prism and Teku clients here. Now, the TLDR that Joe here has tweeted out said the trigger was many attestations using old target checkpoints plus large deposit queue validator registry. The effect, some clients were DOSed or denial of service due to unoptimized attestation validation during these conditions. And the result, of course, was delayed finality and reduced block throughput for 10 epochs. Lighthouse kept the chain alive, but could have further caused issues if a fork occurred concurrently. Less than $1 in ETH lost per validator, no slashing. And the fix was updating the attestation validation logic to defend client resources during similar conditions. So that's the TLDR, but you can go read the full post and the full post-mortem here, which I'll link in the YouTube description below. But great to have this week. I did say that I expected this to come out this week, and thank you so much to the Off-Chain Labs / Prylabs team for putting this out there. I think it's a great way to alleviate a lot of people's concerns around, I guess, what happened, explain exactly what happened, how this was, a bug and not like a critical issue with Ethereum's consensus mechanism or anything like that. So yeah, if you're interested in learning the full kind of scope of this and everything about it, I'll link this blog post in the YouTube description below for you to check out. All right, Hill Dobby had an interesting tweet today where he said over 2 million ETH were sent to be staked this month, and it is only May 17th. And you can see the source here, which is his own dashboard. Now, I actually had some fun before where I was doing a bit of calculations around this in dollar terms, and it was actually quite shocking to an extent. So 2 million ETH in dollar terms, I've actually forgotten exactly what it is right now. So if we do 2 million ETH times, I guess like $1,828, you get $3.6 billion, right? $3,600,000,000. So $3.6 billion worth of ETH has been staked in the last, just this month, right? Just in May, just over the last 17 days. Now, that $3.6 billion, that's actually bigger than most of the L1's market cap out there. So the Ethereum network, just to give you some context here of the scale of difference between Ethereum as a network and a lot of the L1s out there, Ethereum as a network and has had more ETH in dollar terms staked in the first 17 days of this month than most market caps of the different L1s out there. So that's a crazy stat. More crazy stats. There are 20 million ETH staked right now, right? So if you do the dollar conversion of 20 million ETH staked, I believe that would be around $36 billion, I think. I actually want to check my math on that because I want to make sure that... yeah, 36 billion $500 million. So $36.5 billion. That is larger than every other L1 market cap, every single one, right? Every single one. And I don't count BNB, because BNB is not just the BSC chain, it's obviously Binance as well. So I'm talking like every single L1 out there, except Bitcoin, obviously, but like all the other smart contract L1s, like Cardano. I'm going down a list here on CoinGecko. Cardano is at 13 billion. You have Solana at 8.2 billion. You have I guess Litecoin, but I mean smart contract chains. Polkadot at 6.6 billion, and I think at 36 billion, it might even be more, higher dollar value than all of the other L1s put together. All of the other market caps put together, which just shows you the complete difference in scale between Ethereum and every other smart contract L1 out there. And just for context here, Ethereum's market cap is 220 billion. The next closest L1 is Cardano with 13 billion. So it is just so in such a different world. It's a completely different world to everything else here. And that's why when you see these kind of numbers, you got to put a dollar amount to it, because it is a huge dollar amount. I mean, as I said, $3.6 billion just this month of newly staked ETH. We obviously expect that to keep going. Of the total amount staked, over $36 billion, just crazy, right? Absolutely crazy. And if you want to keep track of all these sorts of stuff, of course, you can check out Hildobby's ETH staking dashboard here, which I'll link in the YouTube description below. But I've talked about this staking dashboard a lot on the Refuel before. It is one of the best, if not the best, for tracking all this stuff, I believe. It's just such a nice dashboard. It's got so many different metrics here. I'll link it in the YouTube description below for you to check out. All right, so I guess like in a similar vein or a similar topic of discussion around Ethereum staking here, the Ultrasound Money account put out a tweet today, which I thought was actually pretty mind-blowing. So they said that 4,994 ETH would be issued per day if all ETH was staked. So if all of the 120 million ETH was staked, we would only issue 4,994 ETH per day as new issuance to the chain, as new consensus layer rewards. Then they said, since EIP 1559 went live, the average daily burn has been 5,068 ETH per day. That's mind-blowing. That means that we have burned more ETH than would be issued at the max amount of ETH that could be issued per day based on the current ETH supply. Like think about that for a sec. Digest that for a sec. We have actually been net deflationary, right? Even with since 1559 went live, but even if all ETH was staked, even if we were issuing the maximum amount of ETH we could issue, we would still have burned more ETH per day since 1559 went live almost 2 years ago now. That's just crazy. I'm still mind blown about this stat. I saw it and I'm like, surely that's not right. And I checked it myself and I'm like, holy shit, that's actually right. That actually is just crazy. And the fact that I didn't see more people talking about this is even crazier to me. I just think that they don't understand what this means here. I mean, to me, it means that Ethereum as a network is just completely economically self-sufficient and economically viable. Now, this isn't to say that you can extrapolate this out and say that it's always going to be like this, but if you believe Ethereum is going to keep growing, if you believe that Ethereum L1 is actually going to be a global settlement layer and continue to grow from here, then it makes sense and it logically follows that the burn will stay at these levels, right? It will stay at enough of a level to be above the ultrasound barrier at all times, right? Even if all of the ETH in existence was staked. Now, of course, if we keep going and burning more ETH than we're issuing each day today, this number gets lower and lower over time, because the ETH supply right now is 120 something million. Like if I go to the Ultrasound Money website, you can actually see in real time what the ETH supply is. So I'll bring up the website here. So the current ETH supply is 120.27 million, right? Now, we actually peaked at, and you can see here, we peaked at 120.5 million back basically at the merge. Now, since then, we have been coming down, and we are eventually going to get below 120 million here. But like that's the whole point of having like ultrasound money, of having a deflationary ETH, is that we peaked in supply and now we're going down. The ETH doesn't have a supply cap. You guys know that, right? And the point is that it doesn't need a supply cap, because we generate so much demand for the network that we have something better than a supply cap, which is a deflationary supply, which is just absolutely amazing to me. And often people will bring up, oh, well, if ETH is too deflationary, no one will use it. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. The only reason it's deflationary is because people are using it. There is no arbitrary deflation here. It's not like every Ethereum block randomly, 50 ETH is burned in someone's address. No, that's not how it works at all. Obviously, people have to pay to use the network, and about 70 to 80% of that is burned as part of the EIP 1559 base fee, and that's how we get a net deflationary ETH supply here. So you have to use the ETH for it to be burned. So the bearish take of no one will use ETH if it's too deflationary is just completely wrong, because it cannot be deflationary unless people are using it. So just wanted to make that clear. I know you guys are clear on that, but I felt like it was worth reiterating there. But yeah, anyway, just a mind-blowing tweet for me today. Figured it was worth sharing with you all. All right, moving on. Gravita Protocol is now live. You can open your first vessel now and borrow Gwei using wrapped ETH, Rocketpool ETH, wrapped Lido staked ETH, and BLUSD. And then they said here, you cannot resist the pull of Gravita. Now, I believe that there's a dashboard that I can bring up here that you can track, a Dune Analytics dashboard that you can track the current growth of Gravita. I believe in the, I guess like since they launched, they've got around 6.3 million TVL and 3.7 million borrowed, which is very cool to see that they've grown so quickly already. So yeah, 6.6 million TVL here you can see on the Dune Analytics dashboard, and there's a bunch of different metrics around here that you can track. I'll link this in the YouTube description below. But for those of you who don't know what Gravita is or what it's trying to be an ETH-centric borrowing protocol for the various LSTs out there. So the main goal is really to increase the liquidity and usefulness of LST, so liquid staking tokens, such as Rocketpool ETH, such as Lido staked ETH, CB ETH, BETH, any other future LSTs that come out, and any other kind of like restaking-based LSTs as well can be used within Gravita Protocol, and that's what they're mainly focused on. Now, of course, there are other money markets out there and other lending markets out there that use LSTs, but none that just focus their core, I guess, like value prop on it, which I think is a pretty big deal and a pretty cool thing to do. And I should disclose here, I am actually an investor in Gravita Protocol. I met the team in Denver, super awesome guys. Like, I just love what they're doing. Obviously, anything got to do with Ethereum staking and increasing kind of like the liquidity for Ethereum staking I'm all about. So I just wanted to disclose that there. But if this is something that you're interested in, if you're looking for stuff to do with your LSTs, definitely give Gravita Protocol a look here. Now, I should also say that it's new. It's obviously risky because it's new. Be sure to read up on the various documentation, the audit, stuff like that, so that you know what you're kind of getting into here. There is always risks with interacting with smart contracts on Ethereum, of course. But if you're comfortable with that, you can definitely check out Gravita and potentially use it. I'll link the tweet in the YouTube description below, as well as the Dune Analytics dashboard if you would like to check out their growth as well. All right, so Mustafa here, who works at the crypto division at Visa, tweeted out, "At Visa, our goal is to always stay ahead of the curve. We're currently exploring the untapped potential of smart contracts, the future of programmable money, and payments. We've recently delved into account abstraction enabled by ERC 4337 and the exciting possibilities it opens up." And then he continues with a thread here about this. Very cool to see Visa involved with account abstraction, right, guys? Like ERC 4337, as I said, like back when when I was in Denver, I felt like we were finally seeing movements out on the account abstraction space. We were finally seeing a standard being set, finally seeing a lot of development happening there. And it seems like Visa has joined the fray, which is just absolutely awesome to see. You guys know Visa is very heavily involved with crypto, especially the Ethereum side of things. And it makes sense for them to delve into obviously account abstraction, because that is definitely going to be one of the next big things that we see in the Ethereum space here. Now, if you want to read Mustafa's thread about how they're thinking about this, how Visa are thinking about this, you can check it out. I'll link it in the YouTube description below. I believe there's also an accompanying blog post. Yes, there is. There's an accompanying blog post that was published on the Visa website called Rethink Digital Transactions with Account Abstraction. And you can read this. And this gives you actually a really good overview of account abstraction and ERC 4337 as well. So definitely a recommended read, which, as I said, I'll link in the YouTube description below. But great to see Visa continuing to be involved with the Ethereum ecosystem here. As I've said multiple times before, I don't think that the Ethereum ecosystem exists to disrupt and destroy all of the traditional finance companies. I think it exists to improve their processes, improve their technology, improve the way they do things, and also offer an alternative, right? Offer a decentralized, open alternative rather than going through the centralized intermediaries. You don't have to use Visa when you have a kind of like a mature Ethereum. When we get to the point where Ethereum is just a mature and has a mature payments layer, you probably wouldn't have to use Visa. But the thing is that Visa is probably going to build something on top of it, right? Build their own products on top of the rails, and people will want to use it because it's more convenient, right? But you have the choice. That's always been the point, really, is that you have a choice there. But yeah, anyway, I'll link the thread in the YouTube description below. You can go check it out for yourself. All right, Optimism has announced that Season 4 of Optimism Governance will introduce a handful of new experiments reflecting Optimism's continued commitment to iteration and improvement. You can get the full details from this post here or read the Twitter summary for yourself. So basically, the Optimism, I guess, community and collective is at the forefront of community governance, and they're trying to do a bunch of different experiments with it. And as I said, this is Season 4, so they've had 3 seasons worth of experiments so far. They've done a bunch of different things, especially with the retroactive public goods funding that I've talked about before, and how in the last round, it was actually a pretty big payout for a lot of people, which is very cool. But if you want to know what Season 4 is all about, you can definitely check out the Twitter thread here. But the TLDR is basically that the Season 4 of Optimism Governance was inspired by a lot of research that they have been doing and some handful of new concepts such as collective intents, missions and alliances, and collective trust tiers. So if you want to learn more about all of that, as I said, I'll link the thread in the YouTube description below for you to check out. All right, finally here we have Base introducing something called Basecamp, which is a self-paced learning program for smart contract development designed to empower experienced developers and on-chain enthusiasts alike. With Basecamp, you can learn about Ethereum fundamentals, Solidity development environments, token standards, and more. So yeah, you can go check this out at this website here, which I'll link in the YouTube description below. If you are a developer that's interested in learning about this, you can get started at docs.base.org. If the website wants to actually load for me here. Yeah, so here it is. So basically there is an introduction to Ethereum section, smart contract development section, and a token section here so far. What I really love about this initiative is that, as I've said before, Base, what Coinbase is doing with Base isn't just going to be a massive deal for users and for bringing new users on chain. It's also going to be a really big deal for bringing new developers into the Ethereum ecosystem. Because once you develop on Base, right, because it's EVM compatible, and because it's part of the Optimism ecosystem, you'll be able to export your skills essentially to everything else within the Ethereum ecosystem. Obviously, especially if it's EVM based, which is huge. I think many people underestimate what the actual, I guess, moat is, or maybe they misunderstand what the actual moat is of blockchains, of crypto networks. To me, overall, it's the social layer. But one critically important piece of the social layer is the developer ecosystem. The chain that has the best and most active developers will be the one that gets the most mind share and market share. Because without the developers building all the novel products and services that we know and love and use and love, then the users aren't going to come. Now, obviously, you can't just build it and expect the users to come themselves. There are a bunch of other things that go into that as well, such as marketing and business development and all that stuff there. But if there's nothing to market, if there's nothing to business develop, if there's nothing for users to actually play around with, then obviously they're not going to come to your ecosystem. They're going to go somewhere else. They're going to go where they can play around with things, where they can get the most value from. So that's why it's critically important for new ecosystems to focus on getting the developers to build on them so that the users have something to use and play around with once they come and bridge to the chain, so to speak. So yeah, anyway, you can check out Base's Basecamp. I'll link it in the YouTube description below. But I think on that note, that's going to be it for today. Thank you everyone for listening and watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the newsletter, join the Discord channel, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Thanks everyone.